What do you think is the value of a developer-centric DAST like Bright?
Let's start with a business problem to address that, right? If you look at the market today and what's happening, and there's a ton of research that supports this, right, about 90% of organizations are knowingly releasing vulnerable applications and APIs into the market. Because by the time they detect the vulnerabilities and by the time they identify the vulnerabilities, with today's scans and the technology that exists today, it's just too late in the development lifecycle. And with organizations that have shifted into DevOps practices and releasing much, much faster, it just happens that they have to release. They don't have a choice. Right? And that represents a huge risk for organizations because if you're saying that 90% are releasing vulnerabilities knowingly, or vulnerable applications and APIs knowingly, that probably means that the other 10% are releasing them as well, but they just don't even know about it. So most organizations today, vast majority, are not finding vulnerabilities early enough in the development lifecycle and end up releasing vulnerable applications and APIs. What's the result of that? The result is all the ransomware attacks that we're seeing, and all the vulnerabilities and the attacks that we're seeing on organizations on a daily basis and are being published out there. And that is not good. Turn that into what's the value of dev-centric DAST and why are we focused on dev-centric DAST? The reason we're focused here is we looked at the application security market when we started the focus on this area about 3 years ago. And we understood that there is a big problem, a big gap in the market. Right? If you look historically, and I'm aging myself here, but you look 20 years back or 15 years back, DAST was the dominant AppSec solution in the market. Right? DAST was the number one tool because it's still out of DAST and SAST and SCA and IAST. DAST is still the only solution that actually looks at vulnerabilities as a hacker, as somebody would see them from the outside. All the other tools look at them from the code level, and that means that those are not necessarily true vulnerabilities that will appear in the production environment. Okay, so that's the reason that DAST was the dominant solution. However, with the advent of DevOps, and people and organizations starting to release code much, much faster, which started 6 years ago, DAST started falling out of favor because legacy DAST tools are targeted at the AppSec team in an organization. And that team is a very small team in comparison to the development team. So you can have a ratio of 1 to 100, 1 to 200, or even 1 to 300 between an AppSec person and developers. And then those tools were intended for a world and an environment where organizations were releasing once every month, once every 3 months, which meant that running a scan for 3 days was not a problem if you did it late in the development lifecycle because you still had 2-3 weeks until you released and you could remediate the issue. If you shift that into a world of DevOps where organizations are releasing 100 times a night, which is what some of our customers are doing, right? The AppSec team does not have time to do anything. They're not even part of that process. Right? And running a scan that takes a couple of days is just completely irrelevant. You're suddenly in a world that you have 30 seconds. You have 15 minutes to run a scan. That's it. That's all you can do. Right? So when we encountered that issue and understood that, hey, you know what, DAST, which should be the predominant way of doing AppSec, is falling out of favor because it becomes obsolete, we thought, can we reinvent DAST? Can we create a DAST solution that will start scanning very, very, very early in the development lifecycle? Instead of looking at pre-production or production, can we start scanning at the unit testing phase? Then scan again at the integration testing phase, scan again at the CI phase. Make sure that we're scanning in much smaller increments, dividing the applications and APIs into much smaller bits, finding vulnerabilities early on and enabling organizations to get that information around, hey, you have 100 vulnerabilities, but of those 50 or 60 were found at the unit testing phase, which means that now you can resolve this issue within seconds. Because you're a developer, you get the information, you get the scan that was run as part of your unit testing, It gives you what is the vulnerability. You know that we validated that it's not a false positive. We give you proof of vulnerability and we give you remediation guidelines. It takes you 10 seconds, 15 seconds to resolve the issue. Whereas if you waited until you found this in pre-production or even worse in production, which is very common in today's world, it might take you 2 weeks to solve this issue. What happens to a developer that takes 2 weeks to solve an issue? The entire sprint they were planning is shot. And that's what's creating a lot of the antagonism between developers and AppSec, which we want to eliminate. Right? We want to help AppSec provide the governance. We want to have developers use the tools that have been purpose built for them and made for them so they can use them in an easy way early on, and then provide the AppSec team the ability to validate and verify and get all the information about the vulnerabilities that were found, about what was remediated, what wasn't remediated. Going back to my previous note, you had 100 vulnerabilities. 50 were found in the unit testing phase and remediated right there. Another 30 were found at the CI phase and remediated right there. That not only gives the organization confidence to release applications and APIs that are not vulnerable, which reduces a huge risk for organizations, but it's also a huge money saver because now you're not spending those 2-3 weeks on remediating an issue. You're solving that issue much, much earlier, which takes seconds. So it's a big impact on organization, and that's what developer-centric DAST is supposed to enable you to do. And what we enable you to do now, is our product today perfect? Not yet. Are we working, though, with some very large organizations and very large customers, financial institutions, large technology companies that are already utilizing the product, getting value, and we're constantly getting better? Absolutely.